everybody. I'm Frank Morano. Welcome back. It is great to be here, even greater because of who I get to talk to. This is somebody that I have been an admirer of for literally decades. I had the privilege of getting to know him up close. And unlike a lot of other people that you grow up admiring from a distance and then get to know who only serve to disappoint you, and trust me, there's a long list of those folks for me, this is someone who is even more impressive in person than he is on the radio or in a courtroom. And by impressive, I mean he's all the more anything in person that he is on the radio. He's even funnier, even more intelligent, and yes, at times substantially more annoying. He has been a legendary civil rights and criminal defense attorney. Obviously, his partnership with William Kunstler is the stuff of legend, but a lot of folks in the radio audience will know him from his partnership with another person with a alliterative sound, Curtis Sliwa. And then, of course, he did a very I was going to say very successful show, but he did a show on Air America that was solo for quite some time. And I got the opportunity to know him when I was at first an intern for Curtis and Kuby on WABC, and then ultimately worked there in a couple of other capacities, and then had the distinction and the privilege, quite frankly, of being the producer of the Curtis and Kuby show. And since leaving radio, not only is radio more boring, but I can promise you, Ron Kuby has not become any less irascible. I am very, very pleased to welcome Ron Kuby. Ron, it's great to see you, my friend.
Well, thank you, Frank. I'm really happy to be here. I love that introduction. You should save it and just do past tense when I cross the Rainbow Bridge. That would be great. Okay.
You look good. It doesn't look like you're in any danger of crossing the Rainbow Bridge anytime soon.
Well, thank you. I feel as well as a 67-year-old guy can feel. Happy, busy, staying active. And even though I'm not on the radio much, done a little TV around the Trump world because, why not? But mostly busy with cases in the courtrooms and sometimes on the streets with all of the ceasefire and pro-Palestinian demonstrators who were being arrested, harassed, doxxed, expelled, suspended, and otherwise under this sustained attack for their political position around Israel's slaughter of children in Gaza.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that, but I'm glad you mentioned that you're still keeping busy with the law practice. I was talking to someone about you the other day, and I mentioned that I was going to chat with you for this interview, and they said, "Oh, Ron Kuby, he's still around." And I said, yeah, because it's interesting the perspective that people have when they're used to hearing you on the radio every day, and then all of a sudden they don't hear you on the radio every day. From their perspective, it can be as if things disappeared. But I mentioned your career on the radio, not only with Curtis, but then your solo show on Air America. I have to think there are days where you miss being on the radio, where you see something funny or something that you just want to vent about, and you miss the opportunity to share it with folks. Is that the case? Do you miss being on the radio much?
No.
Not at all.
I mean, I look, there are certainly times and events where I would love to do, say, a 6-minute segment on this topic. And occasionally I do short 6-minute segments on WOR every 2 weeks or so. And that pretty much is enough for me. I don't miss the radio as a business. I don't miss it as a job. I love doing it, Frank, and you know that. I mean, most of the time I loved it. Sometimes, of course, like any other
65%, 65%, I would put it.
Even 70. Well, I'll go as high as 70 because it gets rosier as with the passage of time. Right, sure. 10 years from now, I'm going to look back nostalgically at the whole thing. I really did enjoy it. I love the shows. I love the audience. I love the stuff I got to say right up until the time I wasn't allowed to say it anymore. But I'm kind of done. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of, I'm 67 years old. I've done a lot of things in my life, from talk show host to grill cook to deckhand on a tugboat to civil rights and criminal defense lawyer. And at some point, those things are just done. They're over, and they were great. And it's time to do something new rather than longing to go back to a past which really only looks great in retrospect.
Understood. Well, let me ask you about one aspect of that past, which may not even look that great in retrospect. And I'm sure it's a question you get often, because it's a question I get about you quite often. And it has to do with someone that you were partnered with for many years on the radio, Curtis Sliwa. The question that I always get, including from a lot of high profile people, folks like Rudy Giuliani, Anthony Weiner, others.
Wow. Well, how do you get to talk to Rudy Giuliani? That's like amazing. Does he like appear on your show, or
in any event?
Is
these guys would all ask me, and a lot of rank and file people on the street, was how did Curtis Sliwa and Ron Kuby get along? Now, let me ask you both of those questions. How did you guys get along when you were working together? And are you guys still meeting for dinner and going out for drinks regularly?
The answer is we never much met for dinner or went out for drinks, period. And the reason for that is when I spend at least 5 hours a day talking with somebody, arguing with somebody in public, if there is something that I have left unsaid, some thought that I didn't get a chance to express, I could do it tomorrow. I don't want to see you tonight. I just spent 5 hours with you tonight. So we never hung out much. And part of that was just a function of we have had and have very, very different lives. I have one wife. He's got like 5 over time. I have
not simultaneous, but consecutive.
Yeah, okay.
At least 4 of them consecutive.
Well, okay. Let's not go all tabloid. He had, the imaginary band of urban Avenger commandos, the guardian angels that he was always, Curtis always was busy. He was doing lots and lots of things. And I was always, and still am, more of a homebody. When the show's over and the day's done, I go home to my wife and used to go home to my daughter. The fundamental question is, did I like Curtis? I think that's what people ask me. How do you feel about him? How did you feel about him? And I asked somebody once, what do you mean by like?
Right.
Seriously, what is it? It's like, is your dog friendly? What does that mean? Is my dog going to walk up? It's, hey, we shake hands. Is my dog going to bite you? What is it that you're actually asking when you say, are we friendly? And the guy, I forget who it was a great response. He said, do you care what happens to Curtis when you are not on the air? Do you care what happens to him independent of the show? And the answer to that consistently, although not universally, has been yes.
Oh.
Curtis taught me a lot of things that I never would have learned otherwise. Some of them very positive, and some of them I was able to learn by doing the opposite of what Curtis did, but they were still valuable lessons. We had a good show most of the time when we had a show, and it's done, but I don't harbor any ill will toward him. I despise what he is doing on the radio and his constant snarling, bilious, angry, racist illegals. I call them illegals. Mayor Adams, man without a plan. Just all this like awful crap, all this punching down on the most helpless people. But he's done that before. This is not the only episode of that. Back in the 90s, when there was a big problem with homelessness in New York, and restaurants and stuff were trying to come back, he hired his guardian angels out as sort of a thug squad to rough up or move along homeless people who were places where the restaurateurs didn't want them. So it's nothing new, but it's the least admirable of his qualities.
I was with you guys towards the end of your first run on WABC. Then they brought the show back, I guess, in January of 2014, and you had another couple of years there. The portion that I was there with was with Warner Wolf and George Weber, which I really consider to be kind of the golden age of that program. It's funny about you and your relationship, because I think Curtis would give maybe on a good day a similarly nuanced view if he's asked the same question about your relationship. But he's had a lot of partners on the radio, more than I can list, and I followed his radio career pretty closely. None of them have ever taken off and had the kind of success, either ratings wise or revenue wise, as the Curtis and Kuby show did. What do you think it is about your partnership that succeeded, whereas Curtis and XYZ didn't succeed, at least not to that same extent?
It is ironic that I spent more time with Curtis as a partner than any of his wives have spent with him.
That's a record that stands to this day. Yeah.
Right, to this day. And I never had to sleep with him once. I mean, that's like awesome. I don't know what it was, but I know that it took a while. It wasn't the kind of thing there was sort of instant chemistry. Love at first sight. This is great. There was chemistry there. There was a lot of potential there, but it certainly took me a long time to figure out how to work with Curtis in the most productive way. And by productive, I mean, this is a radio show we're doing. It is entertainment. I want to inform people. I want them to learn something in every segment. I want them to laugh in every segment. I want it to be an enjoyable listening experience. And it takes sort of two people working together to do that. And over time, I was able to back down to Curtis or make a joke when things were getting too tense. Not always, but sometimes. And I learned how to work with him. I mean, the reality was, Frank, and we both knew this. When we were doing the morning show, especially toward the end, we were making a lot of money. And even in 2014, we were making really, really good money. And either of us could destroy the show anytime we wanted, right? All one of us had to decide was, I can't work with this guy anymore, and there's boom, no more Curtis and Kuby. I wasn't going to be that guy.
Let me ask you about the radio audience in general. I promoted that I was going to be talking with you today, and a lot of people, as you can imagine, with what's going on with the Middle East and everything, which I'm going to ask you about, they had very negative things to say. Oh, that's a surefire way to lose listeners or have people not follow you.
How many listeners do you have, Frank?
Exactly. I'm still being threatened with their departure.
Right. You've got like what, 24 subscribers? I suppose if you lose like 5 of them, you'll be. I can't even do the percentages.
The level of personal service they're getting. I hand deliver a videotape of this to their house. But anyway, one guy made a very interesting observation. He wrote, Frank's often spoken about how popular Ron Kuby was back in the day among conservative listeners to a conservative radio station, even though Kuby was a progressive. Frank attributed this to Kuby's sense of humor that made listening to him fun for conservative listeners, even though they didn't share his opinions. One can see from these comments to Frank's post how times have changed. Today, conservatives are now so angry and mean-spirited that they'd not only not enjoy Kuby, they'd try to run him out of town. Now, it's interesting. I've gotten similar responses when I've had Richard Bay on the air. Not from everybody. Some people really appreciate his abilities as a storyteller and entertainer, but a lot of folks now take the view, I disagree with you, so not only am I not going to listen, I'm done listening to any show that's going to host you. I'm curious about what you think that says about the current media environment we're in and just the current polarized political nature of the country we're in today. Have times changed from, say, you started on the air in 1996?
Well, yeah, they've changed. I mean, let's face it. When I started in 1996, and I had a conservative audience member who was, say, 50 years old, that person's dead
Right,
or
right.
in a nursing home, right? So we're sort of left with the angry remnant of the radio audience that used to be. One of the reasons that I worked at doing this, it wasn't an unconscious effort. I knew that the audience was not going to agree with my conclusions, and that was okay. What I wanted to do was to fairly and accurately describe the facts on which I am basing my conclusions, both the pros and the cons, and explaining how I got to this conclusion from these facts. And I think after a while, people got to at least respect the honesty that I was trying to bring to the show. Obviously, I didn't always succeed. I had my own biases, unconscious biases, things that I missed that I should have talked about. But I really worked at trying to be honest with people. I felt that the audience deserved that from me, given what I was doing. And I don't think people care that much anymore, because in order to do that, you have to believe in a shared set of facts.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, for example, when we talked about the Iraq War, the big unknown was, did Saddam Hussein have weapons of mass destruction or not? That was kind of the crucial question.
Right.
And there were a lot of reasons to think that he did not, and a lot of reasons to think that he did. And so the question became, okay, we can't resolve this issue, but given the ambiguity, is this worth going to war over? And people could and did legitimately disagree. But nobody said Saddam Hussein doesn't really exist. He's actually a lizard person installed there by the Jews and their space lasers. Nobody suggested that Saddam Hussein was part of some deep state plot involving Democrats who not just kill children, but import them from Iraq for the purposes of eating them. And other kinds of things that just sound insane, except they are much of mainstream right-wing talk radio. Now, people don't say it as overtly as that. They say, well, we have to ask. There's a question. I mean, a lot of people have said Democrats cannibalize children. And I think it's worth finding out. What do you think? 1-800, batshit crazy.
No, that makes sense. Let me ask you about your views, because I mentioned Richard, and when Richard was on WWRL, for instance, or Sirius Left, I think he was firmly in the mainstream of where the left-wing culture was. But as times have changed, and as the mainstream Democratic Party has become more driven by folks like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, maybe not in terms of an agenda, but at least in terms of the heart and soul of kind of where the left is at this point. Richard is looking more and more moderate. Anthony Weiner, who I alluded to, mentioned how when he was in Congress, he would have been considered one of the more progressive members. And if he was in Congress now and held to the same views that he did back then, he would be probably considered one of the more conservative members of the Democratic Conference. And it's interesting, and I see this a lot on issues like Me Too and all the so-called basket of wokeness issues, how a lot of old school Democrats and liberals, they're looking increasingly conservative when you judge them by today's standards. How do you feel you fit in on the political spectrum as it's constituted today?
Well, let me sort of take issue with a number of your premises. And when we get tired of that, maybe we'll remember the question that you asked.
Sure.
And if so, I'll try to respond to it. The notion that the Democratic Party is somehow driven by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar or something like that is a product of right-wing New York Post style journalism, in the sense that one of the things that's always been successful on the right is to find somebody who is affiliated with something, who says things that are well outside the mainstream of everything, attack that person, and by extension, attacking everybody that person is affiliated with. We see that, for example, in the Gaza protests. Like, there's one person who yells, "Long live Hamas," and then suddenly every ceasefire protester is an anti-Semitic supporter of Hamas. I have to say, as a Jew on Passover, the notion that I'm responsible for what every Jew has ever said and done really hasn't worked out well for Jews as a whole. So I think that the construct of that is a right-wing fiction. If you look at where the Democratic Party is today as a governing group of people, put aside demonstrators and backbenchers governing, they just voted to provide billions of dollars of aid to Israel, for example. Joe Biden could not be more mainstream Republican. Hakeem Jeffries, the minority speaker and probably future majority speaker, is a very, very mainstream traditional Democrat. And look, I understand people hate wokeness, whatever that really means. And that's another kind of Republican.
I don't like to use the term, but it's one of those things where you knew what I was getting at when I used the term.
And it's kind of funny because 5 or 6 or 10 years ago, when people would protest about racial epithets or the use of sexist terms, our predecessors like Rush Limbaugh would call them feminazis. And we would all tell them, the right wing would tell all of those woke people, like, welcome to the real world. Get over it. You're all a bunch of snowflakes. Oh, every your little feelings were hurt. Go back to mommy. These are the same people now. Mm-hmm. Thus, in many cases, the identical individuals who are screaming that because some Jewish students don't feel safe on some campus, therefore all Palestinian protests should be shut down. So I never thought there was any we'll fix it in post. I never thought there was any sincerity in those attacks. It was just something to talk about that riles up the base, another chunk of red meat for people to rip at. Myself, I consider myself, I just don't really have a left-right spectrum anymore. I want people to stop hurting each other to the extent that we can make that happen, whether it's interpersonal violence or whether it's more structural institutional violence that we see in America today. That's all. So I don't know where that places me, but I think that if we all worked a little harder to show more mercy and less condemnation and anger, we'd probably end up in a better place.
Let me ask you about two groups of voters that the Democrats have historically done well with. And by historically, I mean over the last 50, 60 years, and some changes that we've seen in some of those trends. One is working class white voters. Years ago, this would have been considered, especially non-college educated white voters, this would have been considered a group that the Democratic Party would have had a lot of success with. And the Republicans were largely viewed as a party of country club elites, the super wealthy, and people that would look down upon all those working class white voters. Now, the trend suggests that a lot of those working class whites, particularly non-college educated whites, are now firmly in, if not the Republican camp, at least the Trump camp. And a lot of those college educated, wealthier voters are making the migration towards the Democrats. Could the Democrats have done a better job keeping in mind those voters? And I'm thinking specifically on issues like global trade, whether or not you agree with their position, illegal immigration, and globalism in general. Maybe even some of the foreign wars that President Trump and Bernie Sanders both talked about when they were running in 2016. Did the Democrats miss an opportunity to cater to someone that was a large part of that coalition?
I mean, the short answer is, of course, they missed the opportunity to cater to that group. But the question is, what would catering to that group cost the party in terms of its fundamental principles? And I think that the decision was made that the cost is simply too high. The phenomenon that you're talking about really began with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, where you had this huge number of blue-collar Democrats who decided to vote for a Republican really for the first time. And a lot of those people stayed. Sort of the good news is that the labor movement is expanding in a way that was absolutely unforeseeable to me 15 years ago. And the working class remains the working class, but many of them, thanks to the unions and thanks to the social safety net and thanks to all kinds of legislation that protects hours and wages and health and safety, that working class is moved in many cases solidly into the middle class. Now, there's a large group of basically unskilled, uneducated, untrained, angry white people in America, and the Democrats don't give them what they want, which is they want to see a boot in somebody else's face, whether it's a Mexican face or a Chinese face or even my face. And I salute the Democrats for not doing that.
Another area where, at least according to the polls, and who knows how much of these polls are accurate, I think one of the lessons of both 2016 and 2020 has been that maybe these polls aren't all they're cracked up to be. Maybe they're relying on outdated models. But according to at least some of the polls, another group that Donald Trump seems to be doing much better with than he did in 2020 is blacks, particularly black men. It's led Donald Trump to make the comment recently that he was criticized for, that part of the reason he was being supported by blacks is because of what he's going through in terms of his criminal trial. Now,
right,
Stephen A. Smith,
they're all criminals and they can relate to me. Yeah, I don't.
Wait. So Stephen A. Smith, he made some headlines recently, and he's gotten criticized for this, for saying Trump wasn't lying when he said black folks find him relatable because of what he's going through. Give me your take, Ron, on Trump's growth, if you think it's real, among black men in particular, and Trump comments and the related comments of Stephen A. Smith.
You know, before I deconstruct Stephen Smith's comment, I need to know what Taylor Swift thinks. Because when I'm coming to conclusions about what's going on in this country, I look to celebrities who really don't know what it is they're talking about. Because what better way to figure it out? I don't think Trump's going to get a substantial portion of the black male vote. I think that black people have always been, you know, in the foreseeable past, the relatable past, strong supporters of the Democratic Party. And I think that the danger with all of these polls, things are even more fraught than they were in 2016. And I don't think people are necessarily honest with the pollsters. And I think that what people tell the pollsters at the time may be a very poor reflection on what they actually do. So, for example, we on the left, where I still place myself, we're furious with Joe Biden for his unwavering support for Israel's slaughter of Palestinian children. How does that translate into voting? Well, the answer is things can actually get worse for Palestinians, and Trump will make it worse. So we're going to vote for old Genocide Joe. I'm going to put up my sign. I'm a Joe bro. I'm a hoe for Joe. I'm going to contribute money. I'm going to do all those things as substantially lesser of two evils. And having seen both of them, I feel quite comfortable with that. So I don't know whether the polling in any way reflects what people are actually going to do in November.
Well, speaking of Trump, and then I want to pick your brain on Middle East and FISA, and then I'll let you go. I appreciate it. There's one of the things Curtis used to say to you, and I thought it was actually pretty effective. I don't know how effective it was for you, but it was pretty effective in having the listeners go into a different mindset, is when he wanted you to give legal analysis, even if it was about a question that you had strong opinions about, he would say something to the effect of, take off your advocate's cap for a moment, and you were able to, in a very nonpartisan way, analyze objectively complex legal issues. Take me through this Trump case. You mentioned you've been doing some television on the Trump trials. This Alvin Bragg criminal case, even some folks that don't like Trump have been quoted as saying that this is maybe not the strongest criminal case and not exactly a slam dunk conviction. Professor John Bonzoff of George Washington University Law School, he said that he thinks this is the one case out of the four main ones that really should never have been brought. He's not a Trump guy by any means. How do you view this from, aside from the moral need to give Trump a comeuppance, how do you view this case from a legal perspective, the Bragg case?
So I noted this from the very beginning of the indictment over a year ago. I think it's in terms of the evidence of Trump's wrongdoing and the evidence that Trump indeed committed the crimes charged. I think that the evidence is actually quite compelling. And as we see it laid out, we see a much more sprawling and compelling story being told. What I think most of the critics have said, both those who were pro-Trump and just anti this prosecution, is that this case shouldn't have been brought because these charges simply aren't serious enough. That Alvin Bragg, the district attorney, has taken what is basically a misdemeanor bookkeeping problem and has elevated it into a felony by reaching for offenses that were never contemplated when the law was written. I think that that's the main critique. But those people, they're not saying that Donald Trump did not commit these crimes. They're not saying, oh, the evidence is too weak here. They're saying the case shouldn't have been brought because it's too insignificant. Well, I don't think it's too insignificant. I think that, was it a reach? Would it have been elevated to a felony if it were somebody besides Donald Trump? Probably not. But most regular people who cook their books don't do it in order to illegally influence the outcome of a presidential election. They do it, to hide the fact that they're paying their mistress and they don't want their wife to know, kind of thing. So yeah, it's a bit of a reach, but I think it's a good, solid case. And I think Trump has a very real possibility of getting convicted on these charges. And I think Judge Merchan will actually give him prison time. Although he won't serve it until all of his appeals are exhausted, those liberals and their bail laws. So he'll be able to stay out on bail pending appeal and then another appeal, and he'll still be out on bail. It's just horrible. You
were very critical during the Bush administration of a lot of the instances of increasing heft of prosecutorial authorities in this country. In fact, you kind of turn the old axiom on its head that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged. And I remember you used to say that a liberal is a conservative that's been arrested under the Patriot Act. Now, the people that are most vocal for a variety of reasons against the so-called security state and against things like warrantless wiretapping, they tend to be the right wing rather than the left wing. There are still some folks on the left that are vocal about it, but the folks that are most vocal about it in the media and on social media, they tend to be the folks on the right. Recently, we saw Congress pass a 2-year extension of Section 702 of the FISA Act, which critics say not only allows warrantless wiretapping to continue, but in some respects makes it worse. What's your view of the FISA situation and what Congress decided to do there?
So to answer that question honestly, I have to go back to my opposition back during the Bush administration in the aftermath. I mean, look, the FISA has existed well before 9/11. And I dealt with FISA applications and FISA warrants well before 9/11. And I had my criticisms of FISA. Once the Patriot Act and all of its stuff was passed, I was seriously concerned that it was going to be used in a broad and irresponsible way to engage in large-scale targeting of Muslims, of peaceful people who had nothing to do with terrorism, no relationship to terrorism. We really would be seeing mass prosecutions as a result of this surveillance activity and other tools that the Patriot Act gave. And I was wrong. I was completely wrong. The whole parade of horribles that I had imagined simply didn't happen. In some ways, it was similar to my feelings after 9/11 that people were going to start randomly murdering Muslims. And look, you're a country of 300 million people and like 500 million guns. It seemed likely. That didn't happen either. Yeah, there were some killings. I think 4 people were killed in the aftermath of 9/11 here in the United States. People who were totally innocent, including one member of the Sikh religious faith. But given everything, it was not a heavy toll, except of course to those who died and their loved ones. So one of the things about being wrong about stuff is trying to learn from that. And I think right now there are enough people who are overseeing FISA implementations, Patriot Act prosecutions, if any. There's enough attention to it that I'm not particularly concerned about its misuse. So no, I really have sort of changed my view about that. A cynical person might very well say, Kuby, you were all against it when you thought it was going to be used against you, and now you're all for it when it's being used against people you hate. And emotionally, that's right, but my legal analysis, has sort of remained the same. And many horrible things that I thought would come to pass from many things did not come to pass, and you kind of have to learn from that.
Want to talk to you about what we're seeing on campus now in terms of these protests and the counter protests that have emerged as well, and the attention that these protests have gotten in places like Columbia and NYU. But in order for folks to sort of understand where you are in the Middle East, I think most people watching know you're not the biggest fan.
I'm in Chelsea. I'm not in the Middle East.
But you're not the biggest fan of Israel. But when you were a young person, you were actually much more enamored with Israel than you are now, certainly. Tell me, Ron, what changed to have you go from being such a big Israeli supporter, I don't know if you ever considered yourself a Zionist, to being such a critic of the state of Israel and the Israeli government?
So look, I think that's a much longer story than we have time for.
Fair.
That's
Okay.
sort of an evolution of some 40 years. I would say if you wanted to pick a turning point in my life when I began to seriously question my support for Israel. It was in the late 1970s when Israel emerged as one of the only collaborators with the apartheid state of South Africa, sharing nuclear technology, sharing military information, helping the South African apartheid government target dissidents. And I would raise that with my Zionist colleagues, like how can this be justified? And the answer was always the same. Israel has to do what it has to do. Israel doesn't have any friends. And I'm thinking, well, this is not a way to win friends. And that justification, which I heard in the 1970s, is the refrain today and every day since I first heard it. Israel has to survive. What Israel is doing is necessary to its survival. Therefore, we support it, no matter how many children are being killed. And so that's when things changed. Within that, I believe Israel has the right to exist. I support the UN resolution or I acknowledge the reality of the UN resolution that first created the state of Israel by a majority vote of the United Nations. I am not of the Israel is a colonial settler state. Therefore, there are no innocent people, and civilians are a legitimate target, which is certainly one line of thinking. That's Hamas's line of thinking and line of thinking among some other people. I don't subscribe to that at all. I think that civilians are never a legitimate target under the laws of war. So I'm not, but it doesn't matter. Any criticism of what Israel is doing, any call for a ceasefire, any protest that isn't this enough, is met with exactly the same degree of ferocious denunciation by, the Zionists. You're an anti-Semite, you're enabling Hamas. Yes, Jews can be anti-Semites too, like Jewish Voice for Peace, one of the organizations that was banned in Colombia. I mean, there are more rabbis per capita in Jewish Voice for Peace than you're going to see tonight in synagogue, but yet they get labeled anti-Semites. And unfortunately, this alliance between otherwise, quote unquote, liberal Zionists and outright Christian fascists that you see in Congress, that kind of collaboration is deeply destructive in terms of what I consider to be Jewish values, and certainly what I consider to be the values of democracy.
So when we look at what's happening on college campuses now, obviously the campus that has gotten the most attention has been Columbia, but there were also arrests at NYU, and it's going on all over the country, places like Yale. The critics of these protests will say that this is nothing short of rampant anti-Semitism, and they point out how a lot of Jewish students feel intimidated. They'll point to Columbia's move to remote learning. A Jewish professor at Columbia was trying to get onto campus yesterday, apparently discovered that his ID had been deactivated by the school after they said they could not guarantee his safety. Is there any aspect of these protests that you think has gotten a little out of control, and have the protests become anti-Semitic in nature rather than anti-something that Israel's doing?
So first of all, the professor we're talking about has already been under investigation at Columbia for violating Columbia's policies and attacking students. I know that he said his ID was deactivated because they could not guarantee his safety. I question whether that's the real reason, but in fairness, nobody can guarantee anybody's safety, Frank.
Yeah, I hear sirens coming
guaranteeing my safety. I want my safety guaranteed. Damn it! I feel unsafe, Frank. You know what?
when Sammy Gravano was taking out a contract to have you murdered, the NYPD didn't exactly go out of their way to guarantee.
No. What the NYPD told me after I found out there was a contract on me, they asked me, the guy in intelligence said, "Do you have a car?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." He said, "Do you park it on the street?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." He says, "If you ever come out and there's two tires that have been slashed, get out of there."
That's good advice.
So, but I do think we have to talk a little bit about feelings, because if you talk about what's actually happening, yeah, there's been some harsh language from some people. I have no doubt that it was returned by the pro-Israel supporters. There have been minor episodes of violence both ways at Columbia since October 7th. And by minor, I mean nobody suffered any sort of serious physical injury. But what do you do when somebody says, "Frank, I feel anxious"?
Right. Sorry.
Or go talk to your therapist.
Yeah.
Or take a Klonopin. But the idea that when I feel unsafe, I get to have the government do something to the people who are making me feel unsafe is sort of fundamentally wrong. And we see it in a different context. We see it in New York City, where, white people, they feel unsafe walking by the homeless. Okay, I understand that's how you feel, but that your feeling doesn't give you the right to demand the police arrest those people and pack them off somewhere. So the notion that policy is going to be dictated by the hurt feelings and fears of the weakest among us is a really bad idea, and an idea that the right wing has always opposed,
right,
up until like 2 weeks ago. In fairness, it was the left that started this. It was the left that began with speech codes and, trying to prevent Black people from being called the N-word and gay people from being harassed for their sexual orientation. And over a period of 10 or 15 years, these speech codes at private universities became ubiquitous. I always had my issues with those. I never was a big supporter of those, even when they favored people that were legitimately vulnerable and legitimately under attack. Look, if the Jewish students at Columbia, you feel unsafe, talk to mom, talk to your therapist, take some Klonopin, but don't go telling me I have to arrest a bunch of people who are sitting on a lawn.
Last question, Ron, and I appreciate such a thoughtful response to that and the genesis of where these kind of feelings have come from. January 6th, 2001, which obviously was, a historic day for all the wrong reasons, and still
2021, not 2001. I know. It shows how old we are. It's like I used to forget the year I was in. Now I forget the decade.
I get it.
Now, if I can do the 19s and the twos, I'm proud of myself.
Well, what was going on at Congress is happening. You posted this on Facebook. You said, "Please stop, just stop. This is not a coup or even a coup attempt. This is a child's play about a coup. It is counting coup, but with selfies, a dozen doofuses in costume roaming the Senate chamber with is not a threat to democracy." I think you meant which is not a threat to democracy. "Would it be better if they were taken down, arrested, and dragged out? Maybe, but they are just taking pictures and leaving to be cheered on by the other kids, the overage boys in the crowds as, did you get it? I know that weenies in Congress want to think they're living in White House down and Olympus has fallen, but this is more kindergarten and cop. Stop saying words like concussion grenade, because these words mean real things that have nothing to do with what you're talking about. This is the last day of school for a particularly troubled group of children having a massive tantrum who came from terrible homes and will soon to return to them. Stop the breathless reporting. Please just stop. Now, I read that on air that night, and a lot of the right-wing people were saying that you were more right than some conservative Republican members of Congress that were saying that this was awful. You then later on added an addition to this, saying this post is an excellent example of why one should wait for actual facts to emerge before posting. One did not. One is thinking one is an idiot. I will leave it up purely for its value in humiliation. Ron, tell me.
Which I think is fair, Frank, that you don't, like so many people, so many pundits out there, they say one thing, they're like totally and completely wrong. And it's like they never said it. Now we're moving on to the next thing. It's like, wait a second, didn't you just tell us? So I do leave it up there, again, as a lesson in humility.
Yeah, I always get a kick out of the people that were wrong about the Iraq War on television, giving advice on Iran, Russia, Ukraine, you name it, as if they've never been wrong on a foreign policy issue. But Ron, give me your take on January 6th and sort of the change in thinking from that initial post to the time that you learned facts. And this is particularly of note now because they're considering whether or not a lot of the nonviolent protesters can be charged with felonies under Sarbanes-Oxley, and the Supreme Court seems like they're going to be heard on that. Give me your take on it.
So that particular post I posted very, very early on in the riot, and it was based specifically on watching, I forget, a bunch of like Yahoo rednecks, like a dozen of them in one of the House or Senate chambers, just sort of walking around acting like dopes until they left. At the time I posted that, I had no idea of the scale of violence, the number of police officers that were attacked, and I certainly had no idea of the whole backstory of the attempt to prevent the certification of the election by Mike Pence. So it's not a post that stood up well under the test of time, but I use insurrection in a much more nuanced sense, as not just like wanting to overthrow the government, but coming perilously close to doing it. And I don't think the January 6th rioters came perilously close to overthrowing the government of the United States, although they did come a lot closer than I thought, knowing what we now know about Trump's machinations and your pal Rudy's machinations and other like wild and crazy things that were going on there prior to the inauguration of President Biden. I do think that all of the people who participated in the attack on the Capitol deserve some sort of law enforcement sanction. I think the Justice Department has done a tolerably good job of weeding out people who were engaged in serious violence, violence against people and violence against property, weeding them out from people who simply, hey, cool, man, like the doors are open, I'm going in. This is like the people's house, man. The latter group suffering relatively minor consequences, and the former group suffering a good deal more serious consequences.
Ron, I will let you go. I appreciate you being so generous with your time. I miss hearing you on the radio. I miss seeing you in person. It's been great to do this, and I hope we get to chat again in person soon.
Well, I hope so too, Frank, and I hope I don't cost you too many subscribers at this point.
I have very few to spare, so do I.
Right, but if I do, it's like, okay, whatever.
You buy me a beer, and I'm still ahead of the game, and that is.
Yeah, exactly. Bye.
Ron Kuby, thank you very, very much. All right. If somebody sent you this video, if you discovered it in some algorithm that social media felt that you would enjoy, please share it. And if you want to subscribe so that you get exclusive access to these videos early on, you can subscribe on Facebook at facebook.com/become supporter/Morano fan. You'll get them there close. If you want to email me about anything we covered, you can email me at frank.morano@redappleaudionetworks.com. And if you want to hear the podcast of the radio show, you can certainly check it out at wabcradio.com/Frank, and just search The Other Side of Midnight in any podcast app. Until the next time we meet this way, I'll see you on the other side of midnight.